This podcast is on anaerobic respiration, otherwise known as fermentation. So please put that as your heading. The key idea that we're going to go over in this podcast is that this process of anaerobic respiration or fermentation allows organisms to make a little bit of ATP, but without oxygen. So your last podcast talked about how glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain with oxidative phosphorylation work together to make lots of ATP, right at the end about 36 or so ATP total, but it needed oxygen at the very end as an electron acceptor. So we're going to look at the process of doing the same thing, just making a smaller amount of ATP, so we're making energy again, so that's our whole purpose, but in environments where there is no oxygen, which does occasionally happen to some organisms. So if no oxygen is available, as I said, cells will go through a process called anaerobic respiration to get energy. And that word anaerobic means not aerobic or not using oxygen. So the cellular respiration we talked about earlier would be aerobic, using oxygen. A common anaerobic process, as I said, is called fermentation. So this is one way that organisms can make energy in the absence of oxygen. And the fermentation process is going to make less energy or less ATP molecules than aerobic respiration, which was, as I said, the cellular respiration process we talked about earlier that involves glycolysis, citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain. So there are actually two types of fermentation processes that we're going to look at in this vodcast. First one is called lactic acid fermentation. You've maybe heard of lactic acid before, so some of this might sound familiar. And the second one is called alcohol fermentation, so the process of actually making alcohol, ethanol. So our first type of fermentation, lactic acid fermentation. This one occurs when oxygen is not available in muscle tissue. So this happens in our bodies, for example, but also the bodies of any other organisms that have muscles that are similar to ours. Okay, occasionally you might get to the point in some sort of activity where you have depleted your muscle tissue of oxygen. You might still need energy, however, and so your body will switch over to lactic acid fermentation to get that energy. The general equation for fermentation in this way is we still start with glucose, like we did in aerobic respiration. We still turn it into pyruvate, which we did with glycolysis, but instead of sending that pyruvate through the citric acid cycle, it's going to turn into lactic acid, and then in the process make a little bit of energy, or ATP. So that's the general kind of flow chart as to how we get the energy from fermentation. Now we're going to look at this in a little bit more detail, and I would like you to draw this diagram as well as the flow chart. Why don't you listen first as I go through it step by step, and then go back and draw your diagram as you need to. Pause the vodcast so that you've got plenty of time. So as I said, we're going to start with glucose, right here, 6 carbons, and we're going to change it into 2 pyruvates with 3 carbons each, just like we talked about before in the process of glycolysis. So nothing is different there. There's nothing new to be learned in this process. Okay. On the way from glucose to pyruvate, remember we changed 2 ADPs into ATP, and we changed 2 NADs into NADH. Okay, this ATP value is the net value of ATP. Remember, we actually make 4, but we use 2, so it's a net value of 2 ATP that are actually produced in this process of glycolysis. So nothing new there. As I said, the whole important point of going through anaerobic respiration is to make this ATP. Right? So we've made ATP here, which is the whole point of doing this. But notice it's only 2. As I said, a very small amount of ATP produced in this process compared to aerobic respiration. Now we have to deal with this pyruvate though. Okay, the pyruvate right here does not get used for the citric acid cycle. Remember, in aerobic respiration, it gets turned into acetyl-CoA, and the acetyl-CoA fuels the citric acid cycle, which then moves on to the electron transport chain. Instead, in lactic acid fermentation, which is the second part right here, I'm going to change that pyruvate, so both those pyruvate molecules are going to change into lactic acid, which you'll notice are also 3 carbon molecules. All right, so there's just a little bit of shifting around of bonds and hydrogens and things, and we get lactic acid. In the process of changing pyruvate into lactic acid, we take those 2 NADHs that are made and we make them back into 2 NADs, which is awfully convenient because then those 2 NADs can be recycled and reused to keep glycolysis going. So again, the main product we're looking at is the ATP that's produced. The other things that happen, though, is we make some lactic acid waste and we recycle those NADs so they can be used again. This would be a good time to pause it and to try to write down the entire diagram for yourself. Okay, so just one more thing on lactic acid. I'm, as I said, sure you're familiar with this, but the lactic acid that's made in fermentation will eventually build up in your tissue. You notice at the end of the little diagram, the body didn't break down this lactic acid right away. There was no process we talked about. So over time, if you have a lot of anaerobic respiration or fermentation going on in your muscles, that muscle will build up that lactic acid and create this burning sensation. This is why you get sore muscles. Over time, your body will break down the lactic acid, but it takes a while, and you can know that. The harder you work your muscles, the longer they're sore. That means you had lots of lactic acid building up in them. So just kind of a real-life connection to that fermentation process. All right, so the next step we're going to look at, the number 2 type of fermentation, was alcohol fermentation. This does not occur in your muscles. This occurs in yeast and in some bacteria as well, so that they can live in environments that are either low in oxygen or have no oxygen. This is going to be very similar to the flow chart for lactic acid fermentation, except the products are a little different. So again, we start with glucose. There's our fuel. Change it into pyruvate through glycolysis. This time, instead of making lactic acid as a byproduct, though, it's making alcohol, specifically ethanol, a little bit of carbon dioxide, and then, of course, our main product, which is ATP, the energy that the yeast or bacteria need to fuel their cells. So again, I'm going to do a detailed diagram and talk through it. Afterwards, I suggest pausing the vodcast and drawing it for yourself. So here's our diagram. The first part should look familiar. Okay, here's the same thing we talked about in lactic acid fermentation. Start with your glucose, end with 2 pyruvate, in the process make the 2 ATP and 2 NADHs. Same thing. I'm not going to go over that one in a whole lot of detail. The second half, though, is the part that's different. Got our alcohol fermentation. So this is different than lactic acid fermentation. Instead of taking those pyruvates and changing them into lactic acid, change them into 2 ethanol molecules. Each of those has 2 carbons in it. Where do our other 2 carbons go? Because here we had 6, here we had 4. There's 2 carbons to be accounted for yet. They are produced with these carbon dioxides. Okay, 2 carbon dioxide are also given off as a waste product. So these organisms, yeast and bacteria, are putting carbon dioxide into the air as a result of breaking down the pyruvate. The alcohol evaporates eventually as well, which is why when you bake bread, for example, you get that real kind of pungent smell, like you walk into a house and someone's baking bread. That smell you smell is actually the alcohol that the yeast is making evaporating off of the bread as it heats up. So alcohol is a waste product, carbon dioxide is a waste product. We made the main product we wanted back here in glycolysis, the 2 ATP for the yeast and bacteria to use as energy. And again, this is similar. The NAD gets recycled back to be used in glycolysis again. So they're very similar processes in some of their mannerisms, but you have to be careful to make sure you understand how they're different as well. The main differences are, as I said, the alcohol fermentation produces alcohol. Lactic acid fermentation produces lactic acid. They also have the extra carbon dioxide produced in the alcohol fermentation. What they have in common is they both start with glycolysis, so they're both making 2 ATPs, and they both use this fermentation process to recycle that NAD back to be used in glycolysis again. Okay, one more just kind of real-life connection for these guys, the fermentation processes, specifically alcoholic fermentation in this case. A lot of the foods that you eat, as I already alluded to, bread for example, depend on the fermentation process. So yeast and bacteria are used to ferment foods that we commonly eat. And so just to point out a few of these, we talked about bread. There's things like blue cheese, for example, are made through a bacterial or fungal fermentation process. Soy sauce, sauerkraut, alcoholic drinks like beer and wine, yogurt has bacteria in it that help to ferment things, vinegar. So all of those products that we actually eat a lot of are dependent upon this fermentation process as well. So it's not just a matter of getting energy for those organisms, but also impacts your everyday life.